right, Cahaba Lily fans, would like to make a little presentation today about the Cahaba Lilies. Here we go. Let me get that out of the way. So, this will take about 35 minutes or so. The Cahaba Lilies have sort of become a symbol of the wonderful biodiversity and the biological richness that we find in the Cahaba River. So today I'd like to do a little description of their natural history. For me, the Cahaba lily presents an interesting dichotomy. The flower is this very delicate, even a very fragile thing, but the rest of the plant, the leaves and the bulbs and the other parts are very tough and resilient, and they live in a very challenging habitat that very few other vascular plants have managed. So as we go through the natural history of this beautiful plant, I'd like you to keep those two qualities in the back of your mind to help you understand this wonderful plant. Let me set the stage for this discussion with one of my favorite lily shoals. This shoal has been named Lily Heaven by Dr. Larry Davenport, the Cahaba lily expert from Stanford University. So each year for the past 30 years, Dr. Davenport has been the keynote speaker for West Blockton's Lily Festival. And you may have an opportunity to hear him again this year on May 16th, but you'll need to check cahabalily.com for instructions, because the Lily Festival organizers have decided to make this upcoming 2020 Lily Festival a virtual event. This is one of my favorite photos of Larry. He's elbows deep in the lilies, contemplating and photographing and collecting information about the lilies. He's rightfully recognized as the king of the lilies based on his work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the interesting biological characteristics that he's brought to everyone's attention. So, credit where it's due. Most of the information that we'll be sharing with you in this presentation was worked out by Dr. Davenport. So, for example, Hymenocallis, the Latin name for the Cahaba lily is Hymenocallis coronaria. And the Hymenocallis part means beautiful membrane, and the coronaria part means shaped as a crown. And that's that crown is referring to the central feature here. This group of lilies that are found in this genus Hymenocallis are known as spider lilies. And that's because they have these sort of spidery looking long and thin petals and sepals. Now we won't get too technical here, because there's 6 sepals and petals altogether, but spiders have 8 legs. I think they're talking more about the spindly nature of the feature rather than its enumeration, if you will. So the petals and the sepals are identical, and like many lilies. You see the male part of the plant, the anther and the filament. So the yellow thing here is the anther, and the long, thin stalk that connects the anther is the filament. And in this case, the crown is made up by the filament flaring out and joining the filament of the adjacent filament. So that crown is a feature of the male part of the plant. And here, this long, thin green thing is the female part of the plant. So out here at the end, you have the sticky stigma that receives the pollen. And then this long, thin portion here is known as the style, and it runs all the way down to the ovaries down here. So the stigma, style, and ovaries are the female part of the plant. So let's see, shall we go from there? Another typical lily feature or characteristic are the bulbs that this plant makes. And here's a bulb that's not quite fully filled out. It'll get a little bit bigger, but those bulbs, like other lily bulbs, will grow and divide and split and make a pair of bulbs. And then those two will divide, and you've got 4 bulbs, and before long, you've got a whole clump of lilies. And you see that emerging from the bulb are the strap-like leaf blades. And it's not apparent here, but also the bulb will generate a flowering stalk or a flowering raceme. So here we've got the flowering raceme that's topped by all the flowers. One of the interesting things that Larry recognized early on was that the flowers basically only last for a single day. So these are, in fact, very closely related to the day lilies. So in this case, you see an old flower here that was probably old, maybe 3 nights ago, 2 nights ago, the flower from last night, the flower that'll be fresh for tonight, and there's the bud that'll open maybe sometime today or tomorrow. That'll be the flower that's open for tomorrow night, and then the next night, and then kind of hidden behind there's yet another bud that fills out the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 days of blooming that this flowering raceme will have an individual flower presented that night. So when the flower, if the flower is visited by a pollinator, it will go ahead and develop seeds. And here you can see a flower must have gotten a pollinator visit, because all 3 ovules of the ovary have filled out and generated a seed that is easily 1.5 inches in length and about 1 inch in diameter. So it makes a very large seed, which upon maturation, the seed will fall into the river, and be sink to the bottom of the stream bed. So now the seed is kind of on its own now, and you see that this seed has generated this light green vascular trace, and then the root system begins. Now, the reason for this vascular trace is that it helps the roots find a little crevice in which the roots can become lodged, and then actually the vascular trace will contract and draw the bulk of the seed up close, and hopefully close enough into the crevice so that the seed and the developing bulb, which we'll see in just a second, will begin to wedge itself into that tight little space, so it won't be washed away by the current. So here we can see some seeds that are sprouting their vascular trace, or sprouting the leaf blade that'll come up. Here's some back in here that have sprouted. So hopefully those little seeds will get wedged into the crevices between the rocks there. Now here's a clear image of the seed, the vascular trace, the developing bulb, and then from that bulb will come the root system and the leaf blades that'll come up to that. So there you have that. Now, Hymenocallis, that genus, is a group of plants called spider lilies, and this is a different Hymenocallis, a different spider lily. This one's Hymenocallis occidentalis, and it differs from the Cahaba lily, but it wasn't very clear until Larry started looking into this if this was the same species or a different species. So when Dr. Davenport began comparing the plants, he noticed several different things that would distinguish the swamp lily, this Hymenocallis occidentalis, from the Cahaba lily, Hymenocallis coronaria. So for example, in contrast to the Cahaba lily, which basically presents an individual flower every night, the swamp lily will have several flowers going at once. And there are other differences in the width and length and the ratio of the leaf blade, and some other characteristics, some other morphological characteristics. He also compared the seeds of the swamp lily to the seeds, the very large seeds of the Cahaba lily. So you can see Cahaba lily seeds are generally larger, kind of oblong, whereas the swamp lily seeds are just perfectly spherical. Now, sometimes in science, if you're really, really lucky, you have an aha moment of discovery. And you see something that you can only describe as elegant. And as Larry Davenport was working on documenting the physical differences between the swamp lily and the Cahaba lily, he had one of those aha moments. And what he did that was so elegant was to gather up all the seeds and drop them into a beaker of water. And here you see, as we noted before, the seeds of the Cahaba lily sink to the bottom. Well, of course, it would be pretty foolish for a Cahaba lily to make a seed that would float, because it would never be able to get itself wedged into the rocks. It pretty much has to sink in order to get down to where the rocks are. But the swamp lily, you see, all the seeds of the swamp lily float. Well, that doesn't make good sense until you understand what the habitat for the swamp lily is. And that is, it likes it in the riparian forest, way back up into the woods. So when this plant drops its seeds, it's waiting for those seeds to catch maybe a spring flood event. And that flood event will, as the waters rise, carry those seeds back up into the woods, exactly where they need to be in order to root and start growing a bulb and reproduce. So another kind of interesting and elegant experiment that Larry did was he notes that water is not a very good medium for carrying oxygen, but seed germination and growth requires quite a lot of oxygen. So he was wondering how these seeds can have enough oxygen to be able to grow as fast as they do. So what he did was to take a couple of beakers and again divided up the seeds. He aerated one and did not aerate the other. And sure enough, within just a few days, you could see the difference in how much the vascular trace has grown for this group of aerated seeds compared to the seeds that were not aerated. So how does that then play out on the shoals? Because the shoals are actually a good spot for these seeds to try to germinate, because the shoals are these rock ledges, and as the water tumbles over those rock ledges, they become aerated, and they help the Cahaba lily seeds to germinate and grow that way. So here's a shot of Hargrove Shoals, which is probably the largest single shoal or population of Cahaba lilies left on Earth. It's about a half a mile long from the top of the shoal to the bottom of the shoal, and you can see that the shoals run perpendicular to the length of the river, and you've got Cahaba lily bulbs and clumps all the way across the river from one bank to the next for about a half a mile down the length of the river. So that I haven't explicitly mentioned that, but that's another kind of unique thing about these lilies, is that they grow right out in the middle of the river, which is, you know, the active channel of the Cahaba. And that's a very tough, difficult spot for a plant to live and survive, because the water comes up rapidly, it goes down rapidly, there's stuff washing down the river. So there are only a few things that have managed to do that. I'll point out here in the foreground is the justicia, or the water willow, and it has managed to figure out how to live in that situation. And another plant, which you can't see because it's an underwater plant that grows in the shoals, that's really important to the ecology of the shoals, is a river weed, and it's a Pedostomum ceratophyllum. And it's very important because the insects and bugs and snails just love living in the river weed. It's a wonderful habitat for them. The water willow, this emergent plant here, is really important because it's just prime spawning habitat for a lot of different fishes. They like to go just upstream of the water willow and drop their eggs and let the eggs go back into the water willow where they're safe and protected. So generally speaking, when the Cahaba lilies are blooming, the water levels are low and the flow is placid, and this is kind of the scene that you have. It's just a beautiful setting to go and enjoy and wade around in. But streams are not always low and placid. In terms of flow, they're very dynamic, and unfortunately, on occasion, you can have a roaring flood occurring during the time the lilies are blooming, and that's what you have here. You see, at this point, the water level has not overtopped this clump, but it's about to overtop that clump, and has no doubt overtopped some other clumps in here. Here we see where that's happened. The water level is higher, and it's just completely pushed over the leaf blades and even the flowering stalks. These flowers are goners. They're not going to be able to set seed, and time will tell whether this one goes underwater, whether or not it'll have an opportunity for the water to recede, and maybe the plant will just kind of come back and erect itself again. Here you can see the water levels are just dropping, and these plants have not had time to recover very well. And if the water is up for 4 or 5 days in a row, they may not be able to. That's why you do see some variability year to year in the number of flowers that you find. When this kind of event has happened in the prior year, well, in that following year, there may not be as many lilies blooming. So here we have a graph of the average flow rate of the Cahaba River in Centreville, Alabama. There's about, I think, 130-year-long record of flow that they've documented. And they've got an average for the month of January, February, and so forth. And you can see that in the winter and early springtime months, that's when the Cahaba has its greatest flow. And then by April, it starts to drop off. And by mid-May, when the lilies begin to bloom, right about mid-May, that the water level has dropped off dramatically. Now, you might wonder why they don't wait until a little bit later. The flowering occurs in this little interval here between mid-May and mid-June. But the problem is that these plants have to set seed, and those seeds have to grow, and those seeds only have this interval in which to grow when the water levels are low. But by fall, they will no longer have an opportunity to grow, and they have had to, by that time, saved up enough photosynthate so that the bulb can overwinter. The little seed is producing the leaves and roots and so forth, and they need time to for the bulb to enough photosynthate to survive all winter and into the early spring and to begin growing again. So they need as much time, the seeds need as much time as they can have in order to pull that part of their life history off. So here we have some artwork by Guy Orello, and it sort of illustrates all the different salient features of the life history, that the flower is presented for a single night, and that new flowers presented every night. The seeds are there on the end of the flowering raceme. Those drop off into the water where they sprout and start to grow, and the bulbs then become divide and wedge themselves into the rocks in the shoals of the river. He's got it all pretty nicely laid out there. So again, that's Hargrove Shoals, and you can see it's a very nice, beautiful setting. Well, another topic that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service asked Larry to document was where do the lilies grow? And one of the features that Larry figured out was that they seem to be concentrated on this geological feature known as the fall line. The fall line is sort of the demarcation between the hilly Appalachian highlands and the flatter coastal plain areas. Actually, the rivers are kind of steep as they come off the Appalachian highlands, and there are a lot of shoals at that fall line. In fact, there are a number of fall line cities. You've got Tuscaloosa, Centreville, Selma, and Auburn, I think, right in here. But those are all fall line cities because the paddle wheelers could go up the river in the late winter and early spring, but that's as far as they could get. They couldn't get any further because this part of the rivers were too steep. So there were a number of cities formed along this fall line. And that's not just true simply in Alabama, that's true all along the eastern coast. There are fall line cities all along this. So Larry started looking at other rivers, and of course he'd gotten reports from others and knew that the Cahaba lily was growing in the Coosa River, in the Chattahoochee River, and it skips a couple of rivers for some reason. The Okmulgee, and there's another one. Let's see, I can't think of the name of the other one right now, but it skips a couple of rivers where it's not found, and then you begin to see it in the Savannah River system. And so the range, the east-west range, is from the Catawba River in South Carolina now to the westernmost stream, the Cahaba. So the range is the Catawba to the Cahaba. Now it's in the Black Warrior, but it just turns out that the populations of lilies in the Black Warrior and the Locust Fork are east of those populations in the Cahaba. So the largest stand of Cahaba lilies that was ever documented were located on the Black Warrior River near Tuscaloosa. This is a photograph that was made by Alabama's first state botanist, Roland Harper. Dr. Harper is another sort of fascination for Dr. Davenport. Dr. Davenport's written about Roland Harper, and he's a very colorful character. In 2004, a very happy thing happened. The Cahaba River National Wildlife Refuge was established, and that's about 3,700 acres now, and it encompasses about 3.5 miles of the main stem of the Cahaba, and you notice just a touch of the little Cahaba down here, and this is where the vast majority of the biggest populations of the Cahaba lily are located. So that establishment of that refuge is something that we hope will help protect the Cahaba lily. Now, I covered a little bit about the biology of the river, of the individual flower, but Fish and Wildlife explicitly asked Larry, what is it that pollinates the Cahaba lily? So when Larry looked at this flower, being a botanist, he knows that flowers have several characteristics that lend themselves to being pollinated by a particular group. So there are, for example, flowers that when you look at them, they're long and trumpet-shaped and orange and red, and those are typically pollinated by hummingbirds. Those flowers typically kind of hang down, and a hummingbird can fly up to them and poke its beak in there and collect the nectar and get some pollen on its face to carry to the next flower. So the trumpet-shaped, drooping, red-orange flower are very commonly thought of as being hummingbird flowers. If you look at a sunflower, it's this big yellow disc with a brown center. And those are typically pollinated by bees, bumblebees and honeybees and other native bees. They provide this nice big platform for the bee to hover over and then kind of plop down on and walk around on. Another thing that a different kind of bee pollinated flower are the pea flowers, the irregularly shaped thing with a banner and wings. So a bumblebee will come up to like a mint or a pea flower and grab a hold of the wings, and then she's able to poke her head under the banner down into the throat of the flower. That irregular shaped flower is, again, something that is usually pollinated by some kind of hymenoptera. You carry this a little further in that there are flowers that are adapted to being pollinated by flies. For example, the skunk cabbage is a flower that's not very colorful. It's basically just green, but it stinks like something rotting, and that will definitely attract a fly. So flies will get around and crawl around all over the skunk flower and hopefully pick up pollen and then carry it to the next one. So when Larry looked at the Cahaba lily bloom, he asked himself, well, what does this look like it might be pollinated by? And so here you've got that big white disc in the center, and it's about 2.5, 3 inches across from anthers on one side to anthers on the other side. And you got the female part out here. So what it looks like, he added one more fact, that the flower doesn't really create a lot of aroma and smell wonderful until dusk in the early evening hours. So when you put all 3, 4 of those factors together, Larry thought, aha, this is probably a flower that's pollinated in the nighttime hours. So what would have a wingspan that's about 3 inches across? You've got to have something with a long proboscis or beak or a way to get way down here to where the nectar is. So these plants produce nectar to attract the pollinator, but they're way down here. So you need something with a proboscis that's easily 2 inches long or so it can make that reach. So he put all that together and thought, I bet Larry thought it was a Sphinx moth. And sure enough, that's exactly what it turned out to be. This is the Plebian Sphinx moth, and it's the first pollinator that we found actively pollinating the Cahaba lily. So we found this on a shoal in the Cahaba, and it was a lucky thing for me that we found that, because I think when I wrote this little story up about the Plebeian Sphinx moths, it's probably something that helped me get a job with the Cahaba River Society. So I want to thank Larry for providing the idea that secured my employment for the past 25 years. So here's we revisited that shoal where the lilies are in the nighttime hours a couple years ago, and found yet another Sphinx moth, very similar size, and has a very similar proboscis that is long enough to reach the nectar. And some biologists in Georgia have pointed out that the Pipevine Swallowtail will visit the Cahaba lilies in the daytime hours sometimes, but I think Larry provides a pretty convincing argument that these are really designed to be a nighttime pollinated flower. Now, let me just kind of quickly go through some of the threats that we've identified that might tend to knock back the populations of Cahaba lilies to some degree. And let me just run through those. So this is a rocky gravel bar that was populated by Cahaba lilies, but as time went on, sediment started to settle out on this rocky bar, and these bulbs and these plants didn't survive. So their bulbs were apparently smothered by the sediment load that dropped out on them, and that population waned away. So excessive sedimentation can happen in situations that keep the lily from surviving. Another probably pretty important thing are the locks and dams on some rivers. I mentioned before that Roland Harper had described the big shoal on Squaw Shoals right above Tuscaloosa. I think I failed to mention that that shoal was about 4 miles long. So in contrast to our Hargrove Shoal on the Cahaba, which is a half-mile long, you've got a shoal that was almost an order of magnitude bigger on the Black Warrior, but unfortunately the Black Warrior was dammed up and locks were installed. And while the lily can tolerate being impounded or covered up with water for a day or 2 or 3 at a time, it cannot survive being covered constantly the way the lock system did. So the wonderfully big population that was on Squaw Shoals was lost eventually. For a while, there was a considerable threat from people who were simply digging up the bulbs, carrying them away, and trying to sell them at the local Walmart or to other people. So there was some harvest of the bulbs that was occurring. And I've only heard of 1 or 2 folks who have been able to keep these bulbs alive in that situation. So it's not something that's very successful. If you want a plant that looks like the Cahaba lily that will grow in your garden, there are nurseries around that have the swamp lily, and they look very similar. They don't bloom at quite the same time, but the swamp lily makes a good substitute that looks very much like the Cahaba lily. So we'd encourage you to go, if you're going to cultivate one in your yard, to go to the swamp lily, not to dig up a Cahaba lily. One other kind of curious thing that Larry noted in South Carolina one time with the Lockhart Dam, the water levels dropped. The dam was kind of holding back the river there, the Catawba River, and it allowed deer to walk out on the shoal and graze the leaf blades. So the deer that we, this is a charming little picture of a doe in the lilies, but what she's been up to is chomping the lilies, and a bit of a hazard for the Cahaba lily. Now here we are back at Lily Heaven on the Little Cahaba, and you see a nice stand, a beautiful shoal of lilies, but you might note this plant in the foreground is not the same color as the other deep dark green plants. And the reason for that is that they're that clump has been subjected to an infestation of the convict caterpillar. So there's a convict caterpillar, convict because he wears black and white stripes. This is the larvae of a moth called the Spanish moth. It's a pretty little moth, not very big, but the Spanish moth lays its eggs on Amaryllidaceae or lily plants. And I think my opinion is that they're sort of misguided when they do that. Although the eggs can hatch and the caterpillars can grow, these caterpillars need to pupate in the soil. So when these drop off to pupate into the soil, well, they're dropping off. There's the pupa there. That has to be in the soil. But if this caterpillar drops off into the river, it's got no chance of being in the soil and washes away. So that just may be misguided oviposition by the Spanish moth, I think. Another threat, and the one that I think is most significant, is just my opinion at this point, and that is trees and other big objects come washing down the river and they bang into the shoals and they can dislodge or hit the rock that's holding the clump of lilies into the river. They've got to be wedged very tightly, and if you come and whap on that rock really hard, it might dislodge the whole clump. And on occasion, in fact, we have seen entire clumps of lilies that have been dislodged during a high water event, and that whole clump just floated away only to get hung up in the trees in that floodwater downstream from there. And I think this is the last threat that I'll mention, and that's this exotic plant. Here's a wild taro that is grown all over the world. If you want to learn more about the taro, we've got another video that you can catch up on that. But unfortunate thing about wild taro is that it can completely smother and cover up the native plants that used to live there. And in this case, it can grow out in midstream. You can see it gets to be a very large plant, and it's just very dominant. So it can overwhelm the other plants. It has runners that run down, and baby plants start out on the end of that runner, and those break off and wash down into the water willow. And you can see here under that wild taro there, the water willow is simply perished. So much of the shoal area is covered by water willow, and if this stuff gets out into all over in this area over here, it could just cover everything up. And you can see that the water willow habitat and the Cahaba lily habitat are one and the same. So if it can smother out the water willow, there's the potential that it can smother out the lily. And we certainly don't want that to happen. And we've made a stronger commitment as we can to keep the wild taro from growing in the Cahaba River National Wildlife Refuge. And really the best way to do that is to get it out of the river system. Unfortunately, in the Coosa and the Black Warrior, there are places where the water willow has gotten so dense that it's unlikely that they're going to be able to eradicate taro from those systems. So the Cahaba may be our last chance to keep a population of lilies healthy in that regard. Now, I'm going to touch briefly on some other plants that are unique to the Cahaba watershed. In 1992, a different botanist, the one Jim Allison from the Georgia Natural Heritage Program, was looking for a special kind of habitat known as dolostone glades. And he knew from geological maps that there were some dolostone glades on the Little Cahaba. So he went and floated down the Little Cahaba until he got to one of those glades and got out. And before it was over, he had discovered 8 plants that were new to science. So here we have the Cahaba paintbrush, a Castelia species, the Cahaba tickseed, a Coreopsis species, the Cahaba daisy fleabane, and the Cahaba clover. That's it, the Cahaba prairie clover, a dahlia species. And in addition to that, there's the deceptive marble seed, the Cahaba torch, the Alabama gentian pinkroot, that's a gentian plant there, and unique to those glades, and a great big old, about a 5 or 6 foot high sticky rosin weed. And as I went through that list, you might note that about half of those got named after the Cahaba River. And it's not just those, there were other that in those glades had just a whole host of rare and in some cases imperiled species. Here's Moore's barber's buttons, one of my very favorite plants on earth, the Baptisia plants. Here's a Georgia aster, a federally endangered plant. I believe the Georgia aster is an endangered species. And here's a plant that had not been seen for a very long time. I think it was the 1860s since the last time this plant was seen. And this is the dwarf horse nettle. Not a very tall plant, just 4 or 5 inches tall, but it had been described, was in the literature, but hadn't been seen for a very, very long time. So the lilies have kind of become a symbol for the biodiversity of the Cahaba River, and that biodiversity extends to other areas. We've got a wonderful diversity of fishes and turtles and mussels and snails and crayfish. And again, if you want a different little perspective on that, we'll have a little video about that biodiversity of things that live in the Cahaba. I don't think I mentioned that, though, the freshwater crayfish. We have some things living in freshwater that, I'm sorry, a freshwater shrimp. And that's a little shrimpy guy. He's only about 2 inches long. This is a female, and all those are eggs that she's carrying around with her to keep them well aerated. So a lot of really wonderful things living in the river. The last thing I'll say is that the Cahaba River is very nice in terms of being able to pull up to a patch of lilies, park your boat, and get out and walk around. There are other places where the lilies are found, but it's a little bit harder to stop and get out and enjoy them firsthand the way you can on the Little Cahaba River. So if you ever get a chance to go with us, I hope you will, and we can let you have a firsthand experience with them. Well, thank you for your attention, and thank you for joining us. And please join the Cahaba River Society and become a member if you're not. We'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.